The muff as a fashion accessory made from a cylinder of fur or fabric, with both ends open for keeping the hands warm, was introduced to women's fashion in the 16th century and was popular with both men and women in the 17th and 18th centuries, and still worn in the early 20th century, although it was reported that it largely fell from fashion in the 19th century. According to Wikipedia, it is currently out of fashion, which is a shame, as it could be an inherently practical garment and kept your hands cosy and warm on long carriage rides, and indeed early car journeys. As they were mostly made from fur, I can see how they would not be popular now, but they can still be made from other fabrics like wool, silk and velvet, and a luxurious accessory. Or is it that the word has become an inoffensive slang term, according to the Urban Dictionary, that has caused them to fall from favour? Is this a fashion I can revive? Here's how I made one to find out. So to create my quilted lining, I've cut a 15 by 15 inch square of pink silk taffeta and a slightly larger rectangle of quilting batting. This is a cotton batting. You could use just a piece of wool, I've done that before, or you could use a polyester wadding if you preferred. But I thought it'd be nice to keep this fairly natural. And so I've cut it slightly wider than my silk because this bit's actually going to wrap around to the outside, whereas this bit ultimately will probably be a bit smaller. Probably the finished measurement, because this will be seamed along this edge to this edge, will probably only need to be about 12 inches when finished, but because it's going to be quilted, it's nice to cut it with a little bit extra. I've also cut another rectangle of fabric to make the internal pocket, and that's this piece here. So this is 15 inches by 7 inches, and this will ultimately be folded in half and seamed up like that, and will sit inside. I pin the batting and the silk together and then turn it over and do some very quick tack stitching just to hold the two together so I don't have to work over the fabric with the pins in it. The next stage is to draw on my seam lines and the quilting lines. I'm absolutely spoilt for choice for this bit, so retractable chalk pencil, purple vanishing marker pen, Muji removable with friction pen, and some chalk that vanishes under the iron as well. Whichever one you use, however you choose to draw your seam lines and quilting lines, do a test to make sure it comes off properly, because some of the wax-based ones like this chalk and sometimes the purple pen can be a bit reluctant to remove. The Muji pens, which are like the other friction pens you can buy, generally leave no marks on cotton and linen fabrics, but sometimes they leave a bit of a stain on silk, so do a test first. I'm probably going to use the Muji because as it's black, it'll leave the most contrast of where I'm stitching, but I'm just going to go make a test that it will vanish beforehand. So to draw my seam line and my quilting edge here, I'm just going to do I want a nice deep seam allowance. So I'm going to use a grading ruler and just do 1 inch along there. On this edge, I'd quite like the quilting to come further out, so I'm going to do 1/2 inch seam allowance and carry on with another inch at the top and 1/2 inch along the other side. I then mark with the pen again the midpoint of the seam where the pocket will sit and the 3.5 inches either side of that marks the edge of the pockets, so I know where I'm positioning it. And even though I've drawn my seam lines on with a pen, I then choose to tack round those lines again with a tacking thread. And mark those pocket positions as well with the tack stitch. And for reasons I can't quite explain now, I seem to have focused in very closely to draw my first quilting line, which, although it looks completely on the straight of grain here, is actually the longest diagonal across the square. So I decided to draw the longest line first, and then using the grading ruler, draw each line following that 1 inch apart, using the grading ruler lines to make sure I'm exactly that 1 inch apart. But I'm actually drawing out towards the corners, not aside. You'll see this in a minute when I get to the corner. Hopefully you can now see what I mean, as I am now out at the corner. And once I've reached that corner, I go back to the middle and work out to the other corner. and then I turn the whole thing round, and then I start drawing the other way to create the little quilted squares. Here's the finished quilted drawing. So fortuitously I have a little bit of old pink silk thread that I think is a close enough match to do my quilting. Although it does look absolutely gorgeous if you do your quilting in a contrasting thread as well. So again, I leave that entirely up to you, what you do your stitching with. It can look really nice if you use the outer fabric colour if it's different to the lining. So I could do it in a brown silk, which, you know, I do love brown, but no, I'm going to go for this baby pink instead. I try and cut my length of thread to be exactly as long a line as the quilting is, with a little bit extra, so I don't get any breaks or joins along the line. Now I like to do my quilting the same way as I drew the lines onto the silk, so I start with the longest diagonal lines across my square or rectangle, so here, and then so I go across from one point to another, and then I work from that point in one direction to the other corner, and then from this point out to that corner, and then turn it round and do the same going the other way. So I suppose that's in a way that's working from the centre to the edge, rather than working from one corner all the way across. I have no idea whether that's right or the wrong way to do it, but I found that this works just fine for me, so I'm going to carry on with that. I just do little stitches. I don't measure them, I just use, you know, my eye to sort of gauge that they're long enough. Do a few, pull the thread through, and there we are. And then it's just a pleasant little bit of hand quilting. Now, you could of course do this by machine if you didn't want to do it by hand because it's hardly seen, but part of the pleasure of this is that it can be a completely hand sewn or slightly meditative garment, or you could do while sitting watching television or listening to music, or however you like to pass your time. And when you reach the end of your line, simply fasten off and start again at the other side with a new thread. I'm now starting to go across the quilting in the other direction. I now give the whole piece a good steam to remove all the lines drawn on with the friction pen. And so here's the finished piece, which, as pleased as I am with it, and I am very pleased with it, it does also remind me of a sort of mid-century sort of bed jacket or dressing gown. So a good job it'll be hidden as the lining, really. So the next stage of construction is to put the pocket in. And in order to do that, I'm going to take this row of white top stitching out, but leaving my little pocket markers, and cut away some of the extra batting because I don't want that in the seam, and I'll do the same on the other side over here. So I take my pocket piece and line it up with those little notches I stitched in before. I've just got it folded in half at the moment to find the middle, so let's unfold that. And now I'm just going to backstitch across here. So I'm probably going to do it from this side. So just backstitch along there, and the same here, and that will create the pocket, and then we can fold it in half and seam this edge to seal up the muff, and these edges to create the sides of the pocket. And there's absolutely no reason why I couldn't do this by machine. I just thought it would be nice, having gone to the trouble of doing the quilting by hand. Let's do the construction by hand. First stage of the pocket in place. Both of the opening seams of the pocket have been stitched. Without pressing the wadding or the quilting, I'm just going to open that seam with the iron. I've now pinned the lining seam together. I'm going to stitch from the outer point of the silk through to just inside to where the pocket starts there and finish off securely. And the same on this side. I'm going to stitch just from inside where the pocket starts out to the edge. And then I'm also going to stitch down the sides of the pocket bag here and here. Again, there's absolutely no reason why I can't do this by machine. I'm just doing it by hand because I want to. You know, and it's a little short area to practice back stitching. And now everything is seamed up. I can just put my ham back inside, and then I'm going to very gently press this bit open and this seam open, but I don't want to squash the quilting too much. There we are. A little bit more there. So if you wanted to be really neat now, you could herringbone these seam allowances onto the wadding, and the same with the pocket. If I take this out, you can just put a couple of catch stitches there so it all stays in place. But actually this is all covered up by padding, so you don't have to do that. But if you just want to keep things neat and out of the way, that's the next step. Alright, so here are my finished insides, and here's the second one I've been making as well. So this is just a way I decided to make a muff. I don't think it's actually the historically correct or even a traditional way, because normally the side seams, so here, would be seamed to the outer fabric with leaving a small section, so then you sort of turn it through. So what would you normally do? So I think normally one side would be finished off with the outer fabric and the lining, and then they would be turned round so the outer fabric would come over and it would be seamed back down to this side, leaving an opening, and then stuffing or wadding or feathers or whatever padding you were using, cabbage, could be put in, and then that little bit could be sewn up, and then you've got the muff. But I'm going to wrap the outer in wadding, so I've got a sort of cotton wadding, again used for quilting, that sort of puffs up really nicely. It sort of puffs up actually when you cut it, so it gets sort of thicker and the air gets into it, and that will make a nice padding. And then I'm going to cover the outside in velvet. So here is my wadding. I've cut 60 inches length by 10 inches wide, which is the same, slightly wider in fact than this. And then I'm just going to roll, not tightly, quite loosely in fact, so it traps more air inside. And now I'm just going to whip that in place. What I don't want to do here is pull any of my stitches very tight. I want to keep it fluffy and not too constricted. So now to cut the outer fabric, I just need to see how wide this is. So I'm going to sew the velvet down on the inside. So let's say I'm going to sew it onto set it 1/2 inch in. So it needs to be 13.5. So I think I'll cut 14 inches. No, I'll cut 14.5 inches, and that gives me some seam allowance. And it needs to be by about, let's not pull that too tight. So I'll cut 22. So I'll cut probably 23 inches. So I'm going to cut a rectangle of velvet 14.5 inches by 23 inches. So the next thing to do is to seam the velvet onto the outside, and I want to make sure that the seam is sort of this side. So if it's visible, the seam, which it will be, that will be the bit that you hold it to your body, and the outside here. So this would be to the body. This side would be sort of facing the world, and that's also where you want the pocket to be on the outside. So let's see. So sort of here is where I want the seam to be. And let's bring that over. And I'm just going to seam this by hand on the outside. Yeah. So to make that easier, let's make sure that wraps around. Yes. How about you? Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to whip this bit onto the padding to give it something secure to latch onto. Now I've done this in, unsurprisingly if you know me, a brown cotton velvet that I've had kicking around for quite some time. Actually, I used to use it as a throw over a very elderly sofa that had a ruined cover. And I've always thought I'd make some curtains out of it, but that hasn't seemed to happen. And so why not make it into a nice winter accessory instead? So once the first side is in place, you just bring the velvet up, fold the raw edge in, which is your seam allowance, and then pin it down in place. And then it's ready for hand sewing. Alright, and that now all matches up across there. Just going to do a little whip stitch along there by hand. Obviously you could machine this as a seam and then slide it over the muff if you wanted to as well. And now it's time for me to do some more hand sewing where the backs of my wrists will probably get in the way. I'm going to pull my sleeves out of the way this time. So as I said earlier, I decided to make this and cover it in a warm brown cotton velvet, but they do look absolutely lovely if you make them in a jewel toned sort of silk and viscous velvet. They just look 100% more luxurious. And in the 19th century and the 18th century, muffs were often covered in fur for extra warmth and silk taffeta for prettiness, and then they could be decorated as well. Sometimes these seams around the outer edge are also trimmed with fur or sort of little feathers or marabou type stuff. You know, they could be quite decorative, or they could be decorated with silk, like little silk organza puffs. If you look at the different styles, they don't need to just be plain. I like to have the decoration with the quilting, as I've said, on the inside, but you know, you can't really see that, so there's no reason not to make the outside more decorative as well. That could be quilted too, that would look really lovely. And then trimmed with maybe some fur or feathers for warmth, if you don't object to using things like that. I must admit the silk velvet, the seam vanishes a bit more and because the join's less bulky. But no, that's fine with the cotton. And it's not like you're going to be looking at it because it's always going to be sort of towards the body. When I get to the end, I just fasten off with my needle and we're ready to gather the ends. So I've turned my seam allowance in on the side and found the midpoint to this seam, which is here, and now I'm going to do a whip gather all around that folded edge to draw the fabric in so that it can be stitched down to the inside of the lining. So you need a long length of thread with a good secure knot and a really good fasten on here, and then you can work the whip gather. And I don't think you're going to be able to see what I'm doing however I film this. So starting with a nice secure fasten on, if you wanted you could do this with a thick thread or a double thread. If you don't, you just have to be careful not to pull so tight that you break gathering thread. And now, so you just do a whip stitch. I just do a whip stitch along the fold, which will act as the gathering stitch. You could do 2 rows of gathering stitches if you wanted to as well. There's no reason why not. I just do this because you've already turned over the seam allowance, so you're whipping and finishing at the same time. But there is no reason why you couldn't do it with gathering or a running stitch as well. Alright, I'm back to where I started. And now I can do all of the gathering, just gently pulling up my stitches. So I've evened my gathering stitches around the circle and got a nice little jaw of death with pin heads, which is making it really hard to reach in there. And now I'm going to just whip stitch those down and pull the stitches quite tight and they sort of disappear into those gathers. So now that that's all stitched down, I can turn it round to this side, turn my seam allowance in, which to give it a sort of nice sort of taut cushiony look, I've turned in 2 inches, marked, where is it, yeah, mark my seam point again, mark the halfway point, so do another whip stitch, gather around there, and then all this can be tucked in and finished off. This is the final stage, and it is something I have completely neglected to do on any of these that I have made for other people, so my apologies. But I've just taken a bit of ribbon that almost matches my pink silk, made it into a loop, and I'm going to sew it to the inside of the lining, so that if you want to take your hands out of the muff and not put it down, because maybe it's snowy or you're out and about, you will be able to hang it from your wrist while you do so, and then tuck that loop out of sight when you're wearing it. So it would have made sense to do this when I sewed the seam of the lining, but I'm just going to hand stitch it in place quite securely now where the pocket is, so it's not out here and overly visible.